Thank you for joining the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston for our weekly online Ministers Forum. I'm the Reverend Dr. Colin Bossen, Senior Minister of the congregation. These programs are recorded each week on Monday and posted online on Wednesday. They are conversations with community organizers, scholars, religious leaders, and others about how we can collectively address the grave health, economic, and social crisis we are facing. The purpose of these conversations is to offer the members of our community and all who wish to join us online science-based resources and liberation-oriented religious inspiration to get through these difficult and extraordinary times. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Kate Coyer, a researcher and visiting faculty member with the Center for Media, Data, and Society at Central European University's School of Public Policy. Based in Hungary and the United States, she's been studying the role of social media in the spread of misinformation during elections. She's recently turned her attention to look at misinformation during the current coronavirus pandemic. Kate has a PhD in media communications from Goldsmiths College, University of London, and was for several years a fellow with the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. For those of you who are with us for the first time, let me say a few words about Unitarian Universalism. We are a religious tradition that celebrates the possibility of goodness within each human heart, the transformative power of love, and the clarifying force of reason. We believe that we need not think alike to love alike. We hope that you find these forums a source of connection, hope, and clarity. Kate, I'm wondering if you could start by talking with us about the role of the media in times of crisis like these.
Yeah, no, happy to, and thank you for having me very much. Good journalism matters now more than ever, right? At minimum, good media, quality journalism tells us what's going on in the world, helps us understand the world and our neighborhoods around us. And at best, it holds power to account and, investigates malfeasance. And in situations like this, good journalism is vital now more than ever, because it is a scary time, right? And we're rightly reaching out to friends, family, and colleagues now more than ever. And in a fast-changing informational environment, it's even more vital that we get the facts straight and that we rely on good journalism and scientific information and research.
Well, so I'm wondering if you could help us talk a bit about or think a bit about what is good journalism and what maybe isn't, because I think that's the reason why I wanted you to come talk with me today is precisely that, which is we hear this term fake news a lot. There's a lot of sort of misinformation out there, and I'm wondering if you could kind of talk with us or help us think a bit about like what are good sources we should be looking at and what are sources that we should question, and kind of why we might question some sources more than others.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Super important. And I want to clarify also just by starting, I don't, and many researchers in this area, we've kind of stopped using the phrase fake news. In part because it's something that the president of the U.S. has been using as a way of undermining real and legitimate journalism because he doesn't like anything that looks critical or gives critical analysis to what he's talking about. And so with that in mind, I also think it's important that we distinguish between misinformation and disinformation, because one of the realities right now is that people want to share good information. And I think it's important that we remember that. Most people really are trying to share accurate stuff that's out there. So misinformation, and Claire Wardle at First Draft has done a lot of research on this. She has some great resources online for people interested. And when we talk about misinformation, we're talking about things that people are sharing because they might not know better, they might not realize that it's not accurate or that it's not truthful, and they're not intending to cause harm. Now, the result of having all this misinformation out there is very harmful, but that kind of intention of like my father or a friend sharing something that's wrong or inaccurate, they're not trying to cause harm. And disinformation is stuff that is put out there with a purposeful intent to create harm. So when we think about Russian bots and troll armies and some of the stuff from the right, and it happens on the left as well, people purposely putting information out there to try and create chaos and try and keep us from trusting the good stuff that's out there and creating an environment where we stop trusting the media in general and kind of lose some of our rational skills at discerning what's good and what's kind of bad out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of distinction between misinformation and disinformation is really helpful, right? Just to kind of say, okay, there's one thing that's kind of maybe innocuous or not done with poor intention behind it, and then there's another that's like basically what is done explicitly to manipulate people and to kind of undermine democratic society and try to cause social disruption.
And I was going to say, and in this context, especially when it comes to information around public health, I mean, I would argue that there's this kind of third category where, I don't know what we'd call it, like the jello category, or the stuff that is taking shape, or information that's changing. Because one of the issues when we've got something like a public health pandemic and something at this scale is there's information that is evolving as the science and the research and the medical knowledge evolves. So you know what I mean? So that's also, maybe it's a kind of a third category in this context.
So in the current context, there's sort of a category of like stuff that people are still sort of figuring out, right? Like, and maybe a great example of that is the mortality rate in China versus in other parts of the world of the coronavirus, right? Like what, the World Health Organization still doesn't really know what the mortality rate is. And you see all sorts of different kind of statistics floating around depending on kind of where people are talking about it, right? And it's not necessarily misinformation or disinformation. It's just sort of stuff people don't really know yet.
It's ever-changing information. And I think another example of that would be information on whether to use ibuprofen or not, or information about when and where and how to use face masks, and things that are evolving areas. And I mean, but truly, the biggest problem we have with the level of misinformation that's out there is how much of it's coming from the top. And when you see these press conferences with the President of the United States saying something that he's got medical experts on either side of him having to correct the information that he's putting out there, I mean, that's actually the most dangerous form of misinformation that we're dealing with, and it makes it so much harder for the good information to get out there.
So I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about that, because like I know that that's really sort of a lot of what you specialize in thinking about and studying is the difference between, or how that kind of misinformation and disinformation works in our society right now, right? And so I know that like you're based both in Hungary and in the United States, and you've done a lot of research on like Viktor Orban and how he's been using misinformation and disinformation to sort of really prop up his right-wing regime and consolidate power. And if you could kind of talk a bit about how that sort of thing works and how it maybe, the parallels between it here in the United States and in Hungary and kind of that overall process, I think that would be very interesting and helpful for people thinking about.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's a whole other issue. But certainly the stuff in Hungary, where I'm otherwise based, as you mentioned, is very troubling. And just this week, the government passed legislation that Prime Minister Viktor Orban was pushing for, which granted him basically dictatorial powers in the state of emergency. And so much of it was under the guise of trying to address the spread of misinformation, but it allows the government to arrest and impose fines on people for spreading misinformation. And what we see in cases like that is that authoritarians are always going to use crises as dangerous opportunities to seize more power. And really, what this is going to do is be used to repress speech that might be critical of him or his regime.
So, do you think that with someone like the current president of the United States and Viktor Orban, one of the things that they do that's really dangerous and also maybe people haven't really figured out how to respond to is that they take this sort of charge of misinformation and disinformation, which I think can certainly be applied to both of them. I mean, in terms of what they peddle out there, and they use it, they sort of weaponize it against people they don't like, right? So um, we have Orban accusing people of spreading misinformation, and Trump accusing people of, spreading fake news, when in fact, what I mean, I would imagine in both cases, what's happening is people are actually just saying things that are critical of those particular political leaders, right?
No. I mean, absolutely, absolutely, and I think that's why it's important to kind of, in a way, we break down what's happening, what's coming from the level of heads of state, and the kind of stuff that we have more control over in our own kind of personal lives and in our own media ecosystem. So, there is all this bad information out there, and a lot of this, the way we a lot of the scholarship in this area is looking at this, is calling it an informational disorder. That the amount of bad information that's out there and all the misinformation and disinformation, that it is itself a disease, and it's something that we really have to attack and address and kind of fight like a disease. And I mean, and I believe it was in February just of this year, the executive general, I forget the title of the World Health Organization, said that misinformation in this case around this pandemic, misinformation was as dangerous as the virus itself. So that tells you the level of the scale we're talking about. When we're talking about kind of the misinformation, the disinformation, bad information, and purposely and intentionally bad information coming from leaders like Donald Trump, how dangerous that is. And and again, you see it with even well-intentioned friends and family and colleagues. I have been surprised sometimes seeing, the repetition of some of the widely debunked rumors about what's going on, or people sharing, accidentally sharing kind of bad science or rumors that haven't been substantiated at all by any doctors or research. Or, sharing some of the troubling conspiracy theories about the origins of the virus. And you see some of these things, still out there, that this is just like the flu and we shouldn't be worrying about this and there's too much hype around it. And that does cause confusion. And again, it kind of blocks the ability for good information to get to us, and that can be life-saving, that can really help us know how to be safe or safer.
So, I mean, I think that one of the things that you just said that was really striking to me was this idea from you said the head of the WHO saying that misinformation about the virus is as deadly as the virus itself.
Yeah.
Right? And so, I mean, there's a couple of things. Like, one is there is so much misinformation out there. Like, should we be trusting public officials to be making good decisions based on the information that's available, or should we be somehow organizing to pressure them differently? I mean, I definitely think, like here in the United States, one thing that I've seen that's really, troubling and is the fact that essentially the leadership of the Republican Senate, with the approval of the president, has been using misinformation around economics to make policy decisions during this time, right? I mean, so you have the ending of a lot of environmental protections because somehow that's supposed to be like something that will save the economy during this time, which is just not true. Or like here in the state of Texas, we have Governor Greg Abbott, who's like spreading misinformation about abortion by saying that like it's not an essential service. Right, and so like women who can have all sorts of reasons to need to have an abortion are now having to, think about traveling across the state in order to get access to abortion in a time when they're like people are being actively discouraged to travel. Or also, I mean, like everything that I've read from scholarly research on the history of epidemics and plagues, and is that quarantines don't work, and yet that's the number one way that we're trying to fight, contain this epidemic. Um, and so it's like, given that there is all this information out there, and given that clearly, at least in this country, people are making decisions based on misinformation, I'm wondering kind of what and disinformation. I'm wondering if you want to talk a bit about people's motives for spreading disinformation, and if you wanted to maybe also help us think through, in the last few minutes we have here, what people should be doing when they see others sharing misinformation and disinformation online.
Yeah, no, and thank you for that. It's really such an important question. And I want to get back to why it is and how it is, right, that so much misinformation and disinformation gets spread. And one of the things is the emotional appeal of this kind of bad information. Again, especially in a time when we all are, for understandable and rightful reasons, on edge. And the emotional appeal kind of reduces our ability to make better and smarter and more discerning decisions about what information is accurate and what information we should share. And I think about an exchange I just had with my father, who sent me something that was not accurate. It was not true at all. And he said, I don't know, and the headline, and the email he sent me, I don't know if this is true or not, but isn't it terrifying? I was like, no, because if it's not true, it's not terrifying. The terrifying thing is that you're sending something on believing that it might be true, without knowing that. And that is really, really troubling to me. And I think one of the things that, we have to think about how and why things spread so fast, and we can use the analogy of a wildfire. It's hard to put out. They can, be set off in multiple ways, and a lot of that has to do with the centralized nature of social media. And this is what really distinguishes the kind of informational disorder that we're coping with kind of right now. Because of social media, kind of its strength is also its weakness, right? Because most of us are on a limited number of platforms, so it's so easy for misinformation to spread very quickly. And we're also dealing with this in a time where we have access to media, not only in news, not only in real time, but in so many different places around our daily life, whether it's on the television, the radio, our laptops where we're going to do work, or on our phone, right? Like real-time data and news is in our pocket almost every second, so it's available constantly, and but also kind of can be overwhelming. And the other thing is that we're dealing with the significance of social media platforms, and at a time when there's a real crisis in journalism in general, right? The decline of local news, the challenges, for even the most venerable newspapers and news institutions to struggle. So we're kind of getting hit from a lot of different sides, which again really is just more of a why it's so important.
So basically, you would kind of recommend that when people see something that's really alarming that comes to them, they maybe pause for a little while and think about where it's coming from before they send it on.
Yeah.
And that people should also just be kind of aware of, like you said, the centralized nature of both social media and the media in general right now, right? In terms of supporting local news over national news or international news sources. So those are two things that you would encourage us to think about.
Yeah, and I think that we do have a responsibility and a role to play when we see kind of friends and colleagues and family sharing misinformation. And again, this is where we would distinguish between misinformation and disinformation, because we're talking about the stuff that is not being purposely meant to create harm, but is creating harm. And again, just I think it's important that we remember that most people do want to share accurate information, and are more likely than not sharing bad stuff out of fear or anxiety, or not doing the due diligence to fact check. And that's where we can be helpful. And in doing so, I believe that it's also important that we're empathetic when we're correcting folks online, but also being kind of firm and direct in doing that. And when I do that, and I would recommend that it's really important that when we're responding to bad information, that we do so by citing the authoritative sources, right? Cite that article from the New York Times or the Houston Chronicle or National Public Radio or the CDC or the WHO. But it's also important to also know your audience, because if you're trying to respond to some bad information that's from a Trump-supporting aunt who believes the New York Times is fake news, sending them the link to something on CNN is not going to help them see things more accurately. So maybe in that case, try and find a local source or a local news site, again, or even the Center for Disease Control. Sometimes you might also need to reach out personally with a direct message, especially with a chronic kind of bad information share. But those are going to be the more challenging people, because there are folks that truly believe, and we've all got them in our family, circles. I bet people that believe the most damaging and dangerous conspiracy theories.
Yeah, I think that's a thing that everybody experiences, and I think, that many people experience, and I think that figuring out how to relate to people who clearly think that what you are thinking or looking at is misinformation and disinformation is really hard. There is this sort of divide between people who look at certain news sources like Breitbart or Fox News, which seem to have a looser relationship with the truth, perhaps, than others.
That's generous. Yeah, that's one of the that's one of the easiest things we can do to improve our media ecosystem, is not watch Fox News.
Right. Well, we are basically out of time. But I guess the thing that I would just sort of maybe think about ending on is that one of the reasons why we're in this situation with misinformation and disinformation, from what I understand, is that there's been a real sort of intentional deregulation of what media industry are sort of accountable to and for in the United States. And starting back with, I think, Ronald Reagan, and then going through with Bill Clinton, that has allowed for people like Alex Jones and InfoWars or Breitbart or whatever to sort of pose as legitimate journalists when their standards in terms of checking with and verifying sources and things like that are vastly different than, say, the New York Times. And there's also the fact too that I think the New York Times did itself a real disservice in the lead up to the Gulf War, but that's that would keep us here for much longer.
I'm glad you mentioned the example of Alex Jones, because that's when you see it's a perfect example of, really, really just stupid and dangerous disinformation that's out there, to the point where the New York Attorney General had to get involved with a cease and desist order to stop him from, hawking toothpaste that would cure people of coronavirus. Just incredibly dangerous stuff. But the one thing I just wanted to, if I can close on something that, we've talked a lot about and can talk more about how this is. And as you said, this is a problem that's not just about this current moment, but is a huge problem that we're trying to deal with and wrestle with on a lot of different fronts. But of course, again, it takes a really specific nature when we're talking about such public health concerns. But there is an opportunity. I just want to conclude on something positive to say that there is an opportunity for us in here to kind of, do better, to better ourselves and improve our own kind of media literacy. It's something you could even make as a challenge or a game for kids or for family members to kind of trace the source of a story or something that we see. And just and I would say for ourselves, the most important things we could do is, number one, to always cite authoritative sources when we're sharing information. Right? Facebook is a content sharing platform. It's not a news site. Medium is not a journalism site. It's a site anybody can publish, which is great, but sharing something in Medium, I also make sure to check the bio of who wrote that piece and what their expertise or background is. And then second, I would just say if something sounds too good to be true or seems too wacky, it probably is, and to check that. Sometimes I just will, put it into a Google search and see if I find the same story from other more reputable news sources, if I see something being shared from a source I'm not familiar with. There's also things like factcheck.org from the Annenberg School and Snopes, which do a really good job of fact checking, though. I mean, I'm sure they can't really keep up with a lot of the stuff that's out there right now, but they're great, reliable, and trustworthy sources. If it's an image, you can also do things like reverse image search on Google. And I would just add, it's also especially important to be mindful of visual images, especially with charts and graphs. And visuals have such a strong appeal. And we also need to make sure that, before sharing those or before relying on them, make sure that that information is being sourced and that you're comfortable with where it's being sourced. And then two other things. The third would be supporting good journalism, which you mentioned already. That's so, so important, especially in times like this. And then the last kind of the thing I'd say is to take a break from the news, right? I mean, give ourselves a moment of rest and pause and get offline and get off social media for a bit. It's good for our mental health. It's not saying that it's not important for us to stay informed and up to date, but it's a lot. And I think we can kind of better reset our own facilities to make good and discerning decisions about what we share and how we consume news when we've kind of given ourselves a break from it all.
Well, thank you, Kate, for joining us, and thank you to all of our members and viewers for watching. In the next few weeks, we'll be talking with someone about how to participate in the census during this time of pandemic, essential workers who are striking because of lack of personal protective equipment, a religious studies scholar from Rice, and a philosopher from Stanford University, and many others. If you find this video to be helpful, I hope that you'll consider joining us for our weekly online worship service. It's posted each Sunday at 10:30 a.m. and features a sermon by one of our ministers, readings, prayers, and music by our award-winning music director, Mark Vogel. Thank you to our staff for making this video possible. It was filmed and produced by Christian Holmes. Alma Viscara assisted with the editing. We'll see you all online soon and in person as soon as it's possible for us to gather again. And please remember that no matter how isolated you feel, we're all in this together. Thank you.